Hi, welcome. We're just waiting to get started.
Hi, Jerry.
Hello. Hi, how are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Hi, everyone. This is Evelyn Gallego. Looks like we're still waiting for a few more TEP members to join us before we kick off. Okay, we have. Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome. I'm Evelyn Gallego. I'm currently serve as the program director for this contract with NIDDK under Kevin and Jenna. So I'm happy to kick us off and welcome everyone. We're hoping we could get as many of our TEP participants, but I'll just quickly, I'm here to just introduce the agenda. Welcome you all and let you know that today we will be holding the co-chair vote. So excited to have that through, and Karen will lead us. And then Gay and Jabril have presentations regarding the COVID-19 value set. So that will be the majority of our meeting today. And then Karen will adjourn us with next steps. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to Karen.
Thank you, Evelyn. And one quick note, there is the option to view a live transcription. So if you go to the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, you can turn that on for yourself if that's something that will be helpful. Okay. So the co-chair vote, just to quickly recap, the roles and responsibilities of our two co-chairs, there will be one representing the COVID and PASC perspective, and then one co-chair representing the caregiver perspective. And our co-chairs will really help guide our TEP meeting approach, our monthly meetings, and then they'll also work in closer coordination with the eCare project team to facilitate between meetings. And so we're very excited to announce that we have two nominees, Jerry Sills for the long COVID co-chair nominee, and then also Katie Brandt for the caregiver nominee. So I will now give Jerry a few minutes just to give a quick intro about himself, and then Katie Brandt will be able to introduce herself following that. So Jerry, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, say a little bit about myself. I am a health psychologist, so I have hold a PhD. I spent 2 decades at the University of Iowa, mostly in the psychology department, but also affiliated with public health and many collaborations with people, particularly in internal medicine and particularly in cardiology at that time. After that, I decided to try a new thing, and that was I went to the National Institute of Health, particularly to the National Cancer Institute, and I was a senior scientist for about 7 or 8 years, where I tried to, I advised, I guess you could say, and I was involved in trying to get certain funding initiatives put forward and out on the street, and at least one of them or 2 of them did. And also just to try to drum up business for studying morbidity at NIH, which up until recently it has not been very well studied or supported by certain institutes of the National Institute of Health. So I worked on that in a number of different ways. Then I decided I had done what I wanted to do there, and I thought it was time to try something else. And I joined the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research in New York, particularly the Institute for Health System Science, which was pioneered by and is run by Karina Davidson, who had previously been at Columbia University. Very briefly, in terms of what I'm interested in, what I've carried through for a fairly long time is comorbidities or multimorbidities. First, ones that were psychological in nature. So depression and anxiety in particular were of interest to me, and particularly how they might relate to cardiovascular disease risk. But then when I moved to National Cancer Institute, I got more interested more broadly in multimorbidities. And when I went to Feinstein, part of my portfolio is to try to take the kind of trials that they do at Feinstein, particularly at the Institute, and tailor them for people who have comorbidities or more. And one particular protocol that we're presently working on and trying to get funded is about people who are survivors of cancer and also survivors of COVID, and to study them in their survival phase, particularly with regard to seeing if we can reduce two very primary symptoms that happen, particularly among cancer survivors, but also have been reported in less systematic empirical reports, sleeplessness and fatigue, using some psychological or biobehavioral approaches. And I'll say a little more about that, and then I'll be finished. The techniques we use at the Institute are ones that work remotely and virtually through various techniques, including remote sensors, Fitbit or other activity monitors, text messaging, and a variety of other techniques. We've been developing assessments for baseline and then also delivering interventions. One in particular that is now in the data cleaning stage is taking people who are relatively sedentary, middle-aged or older adults, and having them go through a baseline of about 2 weeks, 3 weeks with a Fitbit on. And we monitor how much activity they have. Then they go into what is referred to, and others are referred to, as an N of 1 trial, where they go through a sequence of blocks in which they receive text messages, usually only once a day, which asks them to do certain things. And those text messages correspond with various versions of what are called behavioral change techniques that have been are part of a taxonomy that Susan Mickey and others at the University of London have developed and others have used, and they're like other behavioral intervention techniques. But these techniques are geared to try to get people to walk more through a series of routines, et cetera, and to try to make walking more of an automatic behavior. So instill it as a habit. All of this, again, I say, is remote and virtual. And though I was originally rather amazed at how good a support we would get for that, because this was new to me, I'd done N of 1 studies and done what is called ecological momentary assessment, but were just observational studies. What I've just mentioned is an intervention study, and we have been successful in getting a large number of people to agree to do this and to stay in a protocol for as much as 4 to 6 weeks. I think that this method has a lot of possibilities. It won't work for everything. N of 1 designs almost never do. You can't do it with things that are reversible treatments, but it can be used in a variety of ways. And I think it can increase reach, it can reduce cost, and it can find the treatment that works best for the given individual. And that is ultimately what we're trying to find. And to bring it back to multi-morbidities, the reason for this for me is that there are so many combinations of multi-morbidities and so many unique circumstances that people experience, that to expect that a standard between subject randomized clinical trial will provide them with information that will really work for them, for the specific individual, it seems to me is overly optimistic. So the N of 1 design attempts to try to tailor this to the particular individual and even provides them with feedback at the end so they can decide to try another treatment and see how that goes. I think I've said probably too much, but anyway, enough.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. Some of you may know me. I'm the recent outgoing co-chair of the National Alzheimer's Project, the NAPA Advisory Council. I'm currently the Director of Caregiver Support Services and Public Relations for the Massachusetts General Hospital Frontal Temporal Disorders Unit. So my professional life, I spend a lot of time working with young onset and atypical families. I did nominate myself as the caregiver co-chair because of my lived experience being a caregiver for my young husband, who lived with behavioral variant frontal temporal dementia. And he passed away in 2012. I have been an Alzheimer's caregiver for my father, who's also a veteran, for the past 13 years. So I'm incredibly passionate about thinking about what we can do for caregivers and families today. We may not have a cure to slow or stop the progression that is easily accessible for all, but we do have a cure today for isolation and loneliness. We have a cure for lack of education and understanding. I'm incredibly passionate also about health equity and thinking about the ways that we can extend resources and supports to folks who live in neurology deserts, who don't have access, who maybe materials haven't been developed in a culturally sensitive way in the past. So I'm here to bring my authentic voice, my lived experience, and as much supportive energy as I can to the project.
Thank you so much, Katie. So now we will initiate a vote. It looks like we have 19 voting TEP members present. And Katie and Jerry, I am going to send you to a Zoom breakout room so that the vote can be carried on. But feel free to chat with each other while you're there. And I will bring you back once the vote is complete. So any questions before I send you to the Zoom room? All right. All right, Katie and Jerry, you have the TEP members have voted for you both to be co-chairs of this TEP. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you for the privilege.
I feel the same way. Thank you.
All right, so now I will hand it over to Gay. And just of note, because the vote did take quite a bit longer, we will continue to have the conversation around the COVID-19 value sets in our January meeting. So just keep that in mind. This is not the end of this conversation and more of a beginning. So I will now hand it over to Gay Dolan, who will just give an overview on the approach to data element identification, especially in the context of this TEP.
Hi, everybody. Gay Dolan. I'm a nurse by background and a longtime standards and terminology geek. So this is essentially my role here. So I basically just wanted to go over some elements of data element approach and how we then will proceed with fitting them in with providing terminology where appropriate and otherwise mapping them to the standard du jour FHIR. So if we could proceed on to the next slide. So if any of you have participated in any of the other TEPs, there was a lot of discussion and work with respect to building value sets. And value sets are, many of you know what these are, but these also are called groupers, code sets, but basically they're a list of codes and concepts, corresponding terms from standard clinical vocabulary such as SNOMED, LINC, ICD-10 that define clinical concepts. So for example, if you wanted to identify or query for diabetes, say, or diabetes type 2, let's say, and you wanted to make sure you found all of your patients in an EHR with diabetes type 2, you couldn't just say, okay, make a text term of diabetes type 2, or even pick the most basic term Rather, you need a set of terms that mean diabetes type 2. But there could be, 200 ICD-10s, 100 SNOMEDs, and you would combine that into a unit called a value set, where all of those things represent diabetes type 2. And those value sets then are used either in defining what gets sent across the wire, and or if you're querying for something that is in an EHR. And so we wanted to talk a little bit more about the sort of altered approach, perhaps, from other TEPs where the TEPs have been requested to actually identify codes. And we recognize that the value actually of the TEP, the folks in the TEP in this instance, and in many instances for clinical TEPs, is the clinical and caregiver expertise. And so that's where we will be looking for your feedback, because you're all very experienced, and you're on the TEP because you're an expert in either clinical care or caregiving. And that's where we value you most. I think we can proceed on to the next slide. Maybe even talking ahead of myself. So we will be building value sets in something called the Value Set Authority Center. This is an NIH tool, and it really is just a tool. If many people build value sets in VSAC, and they're all kinds of shapes and sizes and quality. And so simply because they are in VSAC doesn't mean they're, have any kind of blessing, but rather it's a really nice place to build and store tools and enable value sets to be used by others. So we will be building our value sets in there. I'll go to the next slide. So this portion of this project, which is, I assume everyone knows, it's representing and querying for or displaying data in a care plan that is in both supported by both an application that is informed by a fire care plan implementation guide. And so our goal is that the members of the TEP will work together closely to provide clinical and caregiver expertise to determine and textually define. We're not going to be looking for the TEP folks to provide the codes, but rather help us in clearly defining the scope and the purpose and what specific types of concepts that they wouldn't want in a particular value set, and which ones they don't. And I think I saw a question from Shelley. So the steward, Shelley Sparrow, she's familiar with the Value Set Authority Center and also the HL7 standards processes. In VSAC, when you are building a value set, you must have both an author and a steward. And the author, I think we have as MCC, but the steward is the HL7 patient care work group. And because the HL7 patient care work group are the HL7 sponsors for the implementation guide. And so this is who historically has been and will continue to be so unless something changes. So from there, once as we're nailing down the definition of a value set, why we will work closely with whoever from the TEP, from the TEP, for all the TEP members or some of the TEP members, depending on your ability to participate, to standardize these. And I mean, so we'll move on to the next slide. Show that. And again, just FYI, this is kind of a lot. I tried to make it pretty high level, but since we took a long time on the discussion of the vote, which is awesome to have that great verbal participation, and I expect it going forward. We'll have a lot of time to talk about this. So one thing that's, I think, is our personal goal in this this portion of the project is make sure people understand that you need both syntax and semantics. when you're developing standards. So syntax is like the old, if anyone remembers in their old days of English, learning English and learning how to write, you have a certain structure that you have to put the words in order for them to make sense. And that, and in the standards world, aligns with, where in this exchange standard does the information go. Stoplight is always, the red is always in the top, yellow is in the middle, and green is on the bottom. And people conceptually then can understand that in addition to seeing the colors, especially if you're colorblind. Semantics, on the other hand, are words or concepts. And as I mentioned before, in the stoplight paradigm, red has many different words to mean stop. Yellow, also caution, care, discretion, and green, go, move, proceed. This is the right-hand side, the semantics correlate to value sets. And together, when we match up the words or the value sets with the order or the place it belongs in the standards, why then things start to have meaning when you send it from one place to another. Next slide. So as we proceed along, and we work together, you'll begin to understand some places in the structure require a value set in order to represent, like when we were talking about diabetes, and that's a diagnosis, or labs, or goals, and sometimes not. I think it's like times and dates and some other temporal aspects, certain demographics are represented within the structure of the standard and not necessarily, and not with vocabulary, or maybe one vocabulary term and not a set. Sometimes the base resource or profile already has value sets for the concept, and those are some examples: marital status. And so, we'll work before a bunch of time is spent, figuring out what the value set members would be. First, we decide, do we even need one? So I can move on. And this is an iterative process. We'll talk about what the concept is. We'll figure out where that belongs in the standard. If it needs a value set, then we will, develop a value set. We'll even review, for those that are interested, whether or not they, if they have a knowledge about the FHIR standard, do they think that's where this concept goes? And we'll iterate till we get it right. Next slide. Jibril will be talking about some the work that's been done in evaluating the existing value sets, and we will then look at the existing ones and decide, is this something that we can use? Not all value sets in there are kept updated or maintained, or, as I mentioned before, it's not an indicator of quality just because they're there. These are the clinical focus, scope, inclusion, and exclusion statements are the textual areas that we'll be working together to nail down before we even begin to build. Next slide. And I'm going to leave these to go over for a later time, because I don't want to take Jabril's time. But here, I'm sure the slides will be shared. But these are the definitions of what this metadata aspects of a value set. And then the next slide provides an example of the chronic kidney disease that we developed in the first part of this, in the last month, I guess it was the first part of this project. And believe it or not, it seems like a pretty simple definition, but I'm sure Jenna will remember going back and forth a little bit on the clinical focus. What do we mean? Do we really mean all stages? Do we mean, maybe we just mean 3, 4, or 5? And in the end, we end up with that. So this saves time, because then you go back and you then can create an appropriate value set. We'll be talking a lot more about this going forward. But I just wanted to, I guess my biggest takeaway for you all is, let's work together on getting the textual definition of these various data elements nailed down before we head down a long road in the wrong direction or in the right direction. Right, I will hand it off. And unless there's any other quick questions, I'll hand it off to Jibril.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kate, for this great presentation. Okay, so I will be diving into the subject quickly. I'm Jibril Kamara. I'm a public health informatics fellow. I've been involved in this project for over more than a year now. So today topic will be discussing the landscape of COVID-19 value set. The topic, the objective are one, to review the purpose of value set and the importance at COVID-19 value set identification, the why. Next. The second is objective is to discuss the COVID-19 value set curation processes, the how, and thirdly, to summarize key findings and challenges, the why, and lastly, we want to obtain the TEP feedback on some of the existing specific value sets. So why this work is important? So the goal of this work is to identify and curate the existing COVID-19 value set within the NIH National Library of Medicine Value Set Authority Center, named VSAC, to support exchange of care plan data cross-setting. Next. So this is a cartoon we found about the standard. On your left-hand side, the situation is there are 14 standards, and the middle box, one of the guy asked, what 14 standard? Is ridiculous. We need to develop a universal standard that will cover everyone use cases. And the last box, the situation is there are 15 competing standards. Next one. Standards are like two brushes, like everyone has one, but no one wants to use someone else. And then we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Next one. Next. We reuse actually what exists. This is what we are doing with our work on COVID-19 values. Instead to going, as they mentioned earlier, instead to going to actually create new value set, we are assessing what already exists and assess the quality of this before going to create new one. Next slide. How have we complete this work? The scope, again, is to identify and curate the COVID-19 value set within the National Library of Medicine, VSAC, as of July 27, 2021. So basically, our cutoff of July, we know value set like kind of after July 27, we are sure they are adding additional data element, creating new value set. So this is to remind everybody, this were the cutoff of this project. We are the focus, the review, the specific focus of the review we are talking about today is focusing on value set related to COVID-19 value set related to risk status, exposure, infection, diagnosis, and lab test. Okay, next slide. So here is the methodology we use to identify and curate the COVID-19 value set from the National Library of Medicine VSAC. Is a breakdown in the 6 tasks. The first task where we actually search COVID term, different term of COVID to curate them from a VSAC. And then we import them, the task 2, we manage them, import them in Access and manage this data using Access. Task 3, we group a value set using ICD-10, a good classification framework. I know many of you guys are familiar with that. Task 4, we identify duplicate and redundant value set names. Task 5, we compare value set, COVID value set with non-COVID value set and codes within National Library of Medicine visa. And lastly, the last task is we need the team of expert feedback. This is the focus of today's discussion. We want your feedbacks. Next slide, please. What are our findings? Basically, we pull a 634 value set from the national related to COVID from the National Library of Medicine. These are, again, individual value sets. It's like they are duplicated. We duplicate them by OID. That's kind of a unique ID for a value set for all the coding, not only value set. And we categorize them to make the work much more manageable. And we categorize them in five, we divide in 5 categories. And today's discussion, we will focus on category 1, which is, again, COVID-19 risk status, exposure, diagnosis, and lab. These categories includes 125 value set. Next one, please. And from this 125 value set, we came up with 54 concepts. What we noticed so far during this process is that many value sets were conceptually redundant. 2 stewards can create value sets that are addressing the same concepts. This is why you can see the number from 125 to 54 concepts. Next slide. Now we need your feedback for the concept we identifies 54 of them. What are the data elements we need to include going forward in this project? We recommend as far of we are going to group there's one set which is a diagnosis, infection, exposure. These are one group, and the risk status. And the second group will be a lab test. So we will focusing on the first group now. Diagnosis, suspect diagnosis of COVID-19, suspected COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 exposure, and the post-COVID, post-acute sequelae from COVID diagnosis and problem. My question to you, we want to recommend that. Do you have any suggestion? Do you think that is okay to include this? Any questions?
This is the employment. This is the employment CDC, and this might just be asking out of ignorance, but there is this distinction that we've been talking about for a while between, being able to say something is attributable to infection versus sort of occurring after COVID-19 or after SARS-CoV-2 infection, and we can't necessarily prove that it was caused by the infection. So just in terms of coding, I'm just wondering how we should think about that, because it seems good to keep it as kind of robust and simple and consistent as possible. So whether that is just a condition occurring after, or even you could tie it to the COVID-19 later, or is it past diagnosis and problems is the thing I'm trying to understand. Just what does that mean, or versus saying someone has exertional fatigue, or they're different conditions. That's the question. Yeah. Thanks.
That's a great question, and something we've actually discussed a little internally. We do not want to make any conjectures that something, just because it is a post-COVID diagnosis, like a symptom that's associated with PASC, that it is in fact caused by PASC. So when we say PASC diagnoses or problems, these would be diagnosis codes that the clinician has decided or given that diagnosis that this is in fact, or they believe it is a post-COVID condition. So the diagnosis itself, but we wouldn't extrapolate out to say, oh, this person has chronic fatigue and loss of sense of smell. Oh, it must be post-COVID. Does that make sense? So concept would be that the clinician has actually given a diagnosis of PASC. So it's up to the clinician to make that discernment, not our value sets. Does that answer your question?
I think it sort of does. I think it's hard to confirm causality, obviously, and then that leaves us with whether the clinician is making that decision and judgment. I'm a clinician by background, but I'm an epidemiologist more recently. Whether it's the clinician making that decision and judgment, or whether it's the the association in time, for example, of when the condition was occurring.
So, Ian, thank you so much, for raising that. And so the purpose of our eCare plan that we're developing is really twofold. So we're funded by the Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation actually to develop infrastructure for patient-centered outcomes research. And the way we kind of framed this project was, people, especially with multimorbidity, see multiple providers in multiple settings of care, and their data is all over the place. So we see the eCare plan having two functions. One is to improve care management and care coordination for everybody involved. But the other is to really get all the data in one place to increase the capacity to do this kind of research and get evidence. We know there's so much that's unknown now, both about COVID-19 and PASC, and it's a moving target. But what we're trying to do is identify like the data elements that could be shared in an eCare plan, and then it could be used both to improve patient care, but also to do research to find out what associations are robust.
That's really helpful, and it sounds like that would be more in favor of a broader approach, to try and capture sort of any codes that might be relevant, almost whether or not the clinician is able to ascribe that, or trying to attribute that causality at the time. Over.
Yeah,
no, exactly.
So I think
I just want to say that's a good point, and we want to know like what the patient is, what the person's experiencing, what symptoms they have. So we want to be as robust as possible when we do the eCare plan. Jenna?
yes. So yes, I think we're all on the same page, if I'm understanding everybody correctly. We will capture individually PASC associated symptoms so that they would be tracked, but we would not label them as PASC. The only thing that would be labeled sort of as PASC would be a diagnosis code that says PASC, because we don't want to make any assumptions. So from an epidemiology perspective, if the code for PASC were on somebody's chart, the only assumption we can make is that, well, that somebody put the code on their chart, right? I guess we can't even make the assumption always that the clinician intentionally put it there, because as we know, sometimes codes end up in the wrong place. But we aren't going to extrapolate beyond that. So what this value set here, PASC diagnoses, is actual codes that say PASC, or say some form of long COVID, or post-acute COVID, or sequelae of COVID, problems following COVID, codes like that actually draw that conclusion already. But we will also include a value set likely for loss of smell, a value set for loss of taste, a value set for shortness of breath, or other persistent symptoms that are associated with long COVID. Does that make sense? And we'll be discussing those in a future meeting.
Thank you.
So, okay, great. Thank you, Gina and Arlene. As Jenna mentioned, we have the categories breakdown we discussed earlier. We have the sign, symptom. We're gonna discuss the next step, TEP meeting. Okay. So going back to the question, I don't know if there's any other question or comments regarding this concepts here.
I wanted to ask you about the exposure part. And can you give me an example of what you're including as an indication of exposure?
Thank you. This is a good question. For exposure here, we have first, we have this code here. Can you give me 1 second? 1 second, I will get quickly to this. 1 second. I will pull in actually the code and this exposure.
So I just put two examples.
Yeah, I'm putting 2 examples. Okay, we put 2 examples already. Thank you, Jenna.
I put 2 examples into the chat. So one's a SNOMED code and one's an ICD 10 code. So these are actual codes that get at contact with or suspected exposure to either coronavirus, to COVID, or viral diseases. So the ICD code, you'll notice, is not specific, but both of these were included in the value set. And that's something we'll discuss as we move further along, as we start to look at these value sets, is do we want to include some of these broader codes like the ICD-10 code in our value sets or not. But we'll come back to that. But those are just kind of the types of codes that might go into a value set like this, or have gone into other people's value sets that get at SARS-CoV-2 exposure.
Okay, thank you.
Next.
Interest is in PASC. Why even have the diagnosis of COVID or the suspected COVID or exposure at all? Like, why do we need the first 3 categories if PASC is the interest? Asking broad philosophically.
Oh, so the interest isn't exclusively PASC. So this is part, we started developing an electronic, care plan for people with multiple chronic conditions to be able to develop, deliver patient-centered care. So we've already built out the value sets for, as was shown earlier by Gay, CKD, but also, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and chronic pain and opioid use. And with the onset of COVID, we just wanted to increase the capacity of this to manage COVID. So it's relevant in terms of clinical practice of knowing somebody was exposed or not. So not all of this eCare plan is to do comprehensive patient-centered care, not just care for PASC. So that's the relevance.
And I think even within PASC, I mean, somebody may have PASC and not yet have a diagnosis code for it. And I think for a clinician managing that person, it would be helpful to know, if they come in saying, I'm experiencing these symptoms, to be able to look back and see, did they have a diagnosis or a suspected diagnosis or an exposure to COVID that might help inform their thinking about whether this is in fact PASC or not. And so I think, some of these codes might be useful from that perspective, but definitely interested in thoughts from others on the text.
Agree 100%, and I need to log off. I'm sorry, but I agree, Jenna, 100%. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We are at time, but Shelley, I see your hand is raised. Feel free to email me any other questions or comments.
I put it in the chat.
You got it in. Okay, got it.
Nobody had responded to it.
Okay. We will make sure that's
everyone.
captured. Thank you, everyone. We will pick this up in our next meeting, which will be on January 4th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. All right. Happy holidays.
Thanks, everybody.
To all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.